Good afternoon. It's February 11th, 2025, and my name is Eric Settle, and I'm your host of Pinot and Policy. This is episode 4, where a Boomer and a Gen Xer discuss issues of politics, wine, and other issues of topics that are interesting to people. So I'll introduce my co-host, Rafe D'Amico. How are you, Rafe?
Hey Eric, doing well. Good to see you. Our hope is to have civil discourse on what at times can be contentious topics so that we can better understand varying perspectives in the US and the world. And hopefully we can achieve that. What are we talking about today, Eric? What's on the
Well,
agenda?
today, based on the green shirt my co-host is wearing and the hat I'm wearing, we're going to talk a little about the Super Bowl champion Philadelphia Eagles and the impact on sports and Philadelphia. Then we're going to talk about Trump Week 3. It's hard to believe, as most of you know, we took last week off. It was to rest after Trump Week 2, but we'll talk about Trump Week 3 and the effect of some of the decisions they're making that are impacting both the world and our country.
So
We'll
we,
talk a
we
little
needed a,
bit.
we needed a bye week, right? We needed a bye week between the first couple Trump some time to rest after that fire hose of the first couple weeks of executive orders.
We didn't need, or we just needed to have some perspective and give ourselves a week to say, so what did happen last week? And of course, as we'll talk about, we took a big week off. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Then we're going to talk a little about local politics. We're going to talk about my former opponent for Attorney General, who I think is not doing what he should do for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And then finally, now that dry January is over, we'll talk a little bit about wine. We'll talk a little about Pinot and the original Pinot from the region of Burgundy in France.
Love it.
So first, let's talk a little bit about the Eagles. So that was a big victory on Sunday, Rafe. What did you do for the Super Bowl?
That was convincing. Yeah, I don't think there was any doubt in anyone's mind that the Eagles dominated that game from the very first snap all the way through the end. I believe it or not, even though I live in Philadelphia in the Fairmount neighborhood, I actually watched the game in Summit, New Jersey, good hour and a half drive with a good friend, good childhood friend, because we actually had a bet from the beginning of the season where every year, and we've been doing this for the better part of 2 decades now, in the beginning part of the season, we each pick a team. And if your team makes it to the Super Bowl, then you have the pleasure of that other person taking you out to dinner. And as it just so happened, I picked the Eagles in the beginning of the season. He picked the Chiefs. So we had a head-to-head matchup of each of the teams we picked in the beginning of the season facing off against each other. Obviously, the Eagles win. So my friend will be taking me to a dinner at a restaurant of my choice, which will definitely be in New York City and might have 1 or 2 Michelin stars attached to it.
Well, that's exciting. I watched the game. I went a little closer to home. I went to Ballackinwood, Pennsylvania, to the home of my best friend. He and I have watched 4 of the 5 Super Bowls together. Super Bowl 52, we actually sat together in Minneapolis and watched the Eagles win their first championship. And as everybody knows, the game was a little more lopsided this time, and it was a lot of fun. It's funny. I'm wearing today this hat has gone to almost every game at Lincoln Financial Field since its start. It's kind of ratty at this point. For the game, I reconstructed my outfit that I'd wore for the Super Bowl, which was a Kelly green golf shirt and a midnight green fleece and this hat, and it worked.
One of the beauties of sports is obviously connection and the traditions that are formed, but then the rituals that come along with it. And I would call that a very lucky hat, Eric.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. It's something I kind of put away until next season. What also was amazing about the game is just how good the Eagles played. I mean, they really. I mean, I think when you're a Philadelphia sports fan, you don't really ever appreciate how good your teams are. And this team is probably one of the best Eagles teams that anyone's ever seen. And it was just amazing to frankly blow out one of the greatest teams in football history, which is the Kansas City Chiefs that were going for their third consecutive Super Bowl. But they looked a lot like the Harriton High School Rams, which was my alma
Right.
mater's team that never really had a very good year.
I think it is the greatest Eagles team of all time. And the fun part is it's incredibly young. It's a very young team And we've got probably some well-deserved high hopes to assume that this Sirianni team, led by Jalen Hurts and many others, I think Hurts, to his credit, gave a lot of credit to the Eagles defense, just like Saquon Barkley gives a lot of credit to the Eagles offensive line. True team sport, a lot of camaraderie. And given, like I said, given the age, I think we've got a lot of fun years ahead of watching this group, assuming Howie Roseman can keep them together the way that he's been able to keep them together. But a nice pivot point is President Donald Trump was in attendance, a very rare sitting president actually attending the game and watching. And like we said, he's been busy the past few weeks.
Yeah, it's interesting. People ask that question, like, why is it that presidents don't usually why is he the first sitting president? And the answer is that most presidents know that the security situation at a Super Bowl is complicated enough that you don't also need to have the most important person in the free world adding more risk. But he was there. He apparently said something nice about our team yesterday. And I will tell you the one other thing about success and why sports teams are important in such a divided world. And we're going to talk in a minute about some of the stuff that's going on that really is dividing our country. Sports is the one thing that I think's left that allows people to come together in a common purpose. That regardless of your party, regardless of your race, regardless of your income, everyone can have a conversation about the Eagles as true equals. There's so little left in our world that I've said this for years, that there's often this debate about public funding of stadiums. And, we started off our podcast, 4 weeks ago talking about, the Sixers stadium. And the fact of the matter is that was going to be done with all private dollars, which is unique. But the truth is that public dollars supporting teams and cities is important, and we see the impact of that, and we'll see it even more dramatically at the end of this week when, probably 1 million Philadelphians and people from outside of Philadelphia will gather in Philadelphia, gather outside not too far from your primary residence and celebrate what was a great year. And, it's February, and February is kind of cold and dark, and this is one last moment to sort of smile about the winter.
It does give a little ray of sunshine and can be inspirational for some people in dark times. Someone recently I read, similar topic, speaking anecdotally about how sports can lift people up, and they referenced when Mike Piazza, hit a home run, and I believe in the World Series. Or maybe the playoffs, because it was it was directly after September 11th, right? So it had to be end of the season, near the playoffs. And there are times where government officials and leagues have to make tough decisions when there are horrific events like that. It doesn't make sense to continue playing the sport. And a lot of the times they err on the side of playing the sport because of how it uplifts people. And there was a mother who mentioned that after that home run, and she had just lost her husband, and her son had just lost her father, or had lost his father in 9/11 in one of the buildings that collapsed. It was the first time that she saw her very young, I think like 9-year-old son, smile since his father's death. So sports can be very uplifting in that sense. But to play devil's advocate, to take the other side of it, you could also make the argument that sports encourages tribalism, and sports maybe distracts us from some of the bigger issues that are at hand that do impact us more and affect us more on a day-to-day and very financial or mental health or just really lifestyle hardship level, which is a nice segue for us to talk about some of those impacts that recently happened. And if we do shift to that, I think you could probably set the table better than I could here, Eric. But I know you wanted to talk about some of the funding cuts that are on the table with NIH.
Sure. One of the things that, we've talked about before about Donald Trump and his rhetoric is often this idea of don't get wrapped around the axle about what he says, but focus on what he does. And this week was one of those weeks when he did something at the end of last week that really impacts millions and millions of Americans, which is through the DOGE process. They changed the funding mechanism for grants for medical research all over the country, which is billions and billions of dollars that support biomedical research and other research to help save American lives and, by extension, lives around the world.
So let's for the layperson like myself, what is I know NIH stands for National Institute of
Is
Health.
yes.
So what is the functionality of NIH? What does it do? How does it impact everyday Americans?
Right. So the NIH, the National Institute of Health, is a division of the Department of Health and Human Services. And their purpose is to do research and to also fund research around the country. And so what researchers do, what graduate students do, what professors do, is you make a application to the National Institute of Health to fund some kind of research that you're doing related to something, whether it's cancer research or lupus or, you can't, all the possible diseases. And that funding helps support, doesn't pay for all of it, but helps support that research. And in the absence of that research, a lot of that funding can't take place. And what the Trump administration did this week is they changed the formula that says that no more than 15% of the funding can go for overhead. So on its face, it seems sort of reasonable. They say, well, 15% for overhead, that seems fair. But the reality is that so much of the cost of doing scientific research is overheads, not direct research. So the example, I have a son who's a PhD scientist. They have, in order to keep their cells that they're examining alive and fresh, they have like 80 below zero refrigerators. Okay. So running those refrigerators is enormously expensive. It doesn't, it's not directly the research, but you can't do the research unless you can keep these cells frozen while you're trying to figure out, where you're trying to understand what those cells are doing. So that's sort of a basic overview of what it does.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of strategy that people can get behind and wrap their heads around. If the strategy is we want our government to be more efficient and we want to eliminate waste, I feel like both sides of the aisle can get behind that,
Right.
But then it gets, when you look at the tactics that are being used in this case, doesn't it feel like it's not exactly well thought out or thought through? That by the example that you just gave is a perfect example of, okay, you're trying to eliminate waste, we get that, and maybe there's some wasteful spending, but what about this exact example of how if you don't have the ability to refrigerate something that needs to stay at a certain temperature, then there's no point in doing any research because you're going to lose it all.
Right. And I think, look, part of it is this idea of, I agree with you, the idea of trying to reduce waste, even the idea of reducing the amount of money that goes to the NIH for these kinds of grants is a perfectly reasonable policy position to take. What's not okay is turning off the website. Okay.
Right. So that's what I mean. It's like I feel like it's like a ready, fire, aim mentality by the administration.
Well, and again, I think part of it comes from the guy who's doing it, which is not Donald Trump. It's Elon Musk,
right?
Whose approach is run fast, break things, and then try again. And that works. We've all watched some spectacular disasters at SpaceX. Okay. But that's not how you can run a government. In other words, so I think much of what's going on right now is not that it's wrong. It's that you can't do it that way. In part, you can't do it that way because legally the Congress has allocated money for specific things. And that the executive, when you think about it, when the Congress passes an appropriation bill, it's a law that says, executive branch, here's $1 million, here's how we want you to spend it. Okay. So it's the job of the executive branch to execute the laws. That's why they're called the executive branch. So what's happening here is all these changes are being done in a way that are extra legal. In other words, basically they're saying is, yeah, we know it's not legal, but we're going to do it anyway. And what has been good is so far, the court system has basically defended the rules that say, look, if you want to make this change to the NIH, you can, okay? But there's rulemaking, and you have to issue a new rule that says that going forward, only 15% of money can go for overhead. And then there can be a discussion about, well, does that make sense?
So yeah, and it gets into federal law versus state law, and how laws are the rule of law itself, right? Because like you just said, Congress creates laws and changes laws, and that's how our government is set up. And it's like we're essentially bypassing that because of the mentality of this disruption mentality, right? The famous adage that you mentioned from Silicon Valley and startups, which is move fast and break things. And while that might work really well for a startup and disrupting an industry in the business world, it doesn't necessarily translate to government and a society when you have somebody like an Elon Musk who just wants to be an agent of chaos, so that it's almost like he gets to create the mess, and then Trump and the rest of the administration get to come in and play cleanup, and then maybe they present something before Congress that is legislation that could potentially get passed and have this done the right and legal way. Like where I guess what I'm getting at is like where do you think all of this ends, and what is the path to get there?
Well, it's interesting. In some ways, one of the issues here is that the Congress, which is marginally controlled by the Republican Party, has been unwilling to act. In other words, they have been unwilling to say anything other than, well, the president got elected and he has a mandate, and therefore we're going to support him. So that's a problem. So there's a problem. So there's no, the Congress is clearly not acting. The courts are acting. And, these cases they're starting the federal court, start with the federal courts, will work their way up eventually to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court will issue a decision that says, yeah, you can't do it this way. But then the question is one of two things. Is one, which is upsetting, which is by the time it gets to the Supreme Court, will the damage have been permanently done? Will the defrosted cells that had to be unplugged never be able to be used again? So will there be research and progress lost while things were moving fast and breaking? But even worse is a Supreme Court says, yeah, you can't do it this way. And the executive branch says, yeah, so what? And interestingly enough, this weekend, J.D. Vance, our vice president, tweeted out that, a federal judge can't overturn a lawful order by a president. And the answer is yeah, that's what a rule of law, that's checks and balances. The answer is we built three branches of government, and the courts can tell the president, no, you can't do that. And so that idea of something that Andrew Jackson, and I know that you're a bit of a presidential scholar, Andrew Jackson in a case in 1830s, said to then Chief Justice John Marshall, he says, well, if Mr. Marshall made the rule, then let Mr. Marshall enforce it. And that apparently was not necessarily exactly what he said, but that's the idea, which is when the courts finally say, hey, you can't do this, does this executive branch follow the dictates of the court? Or do they say, no, we're not going to do that? And then does the Congress, is that enough for the Congress to stand up and say, yeah, that's not okay? And that's where people get impeached. But as this president was impeached twice and was never held accountable for the crimes that he was, impeached. As everybody knows, impeached just means you're indicted. But he was found, not guilty both times. So it's a little scary. So what the real answer is that is, practically we've got to get through 2 years of this, and if the Congress, if the House or the Senate can change into Democratic hands, then there will be a check.
But until then, it's close to carte blanche.
Well, until then, it's certainly carte blanche on the political side. I think the question is whether or not the decision, whether the Supreme Court upholds the president's actions. And by the way, there is a possibility that the Supreme Court may look at these situations, many of them, not all of them, and say the president has this authority. There's a legal concept called the unitary executive, which essentially says that the President of the United States has not unlimited power, but that everything in the executive branch reports to the president. And it comes up where some of these independent agencies, so like the National Labor Relations Board chairman was fired last week or 2 weeks ago. And the answer is you're not supposed to fire the chairman of an independent agency. They're appointed by the president for a set of years. And so that firing is unlawful. I worked on a case. Yeah, I worked on a case years ago for Governor Ridge where we fired a commissioner of the Delaware Port Authority, and the court upheld our ability to make that firing. There was an argument about when you're appointed for a term of years, does that mean you can be in that position for those number of years, or whether you really are appointed at what they call at the pleasure of the president.
Which is interesting and makes me wonder how that applies to the Federal Reserve and Jerome Powell being the chairman of the Fed, and how Trump has threatened that he should step down and maybe he'll fire him. Does he have the right to fire him?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know whether he can actually fire the Fed chair, or whether the Fed chair. And again, you have these practical moments where you have these people being ushered out of buildings. You have, in the case of the USAID, the aid agency, they took the name off the building. I mean, there's some really weird stuff happening in the first 3 weeks that most of it is not legal. But right now, other than a group of attorney generals around the country who are bringing lawsuits to stop it, and federal judges who are, for the most part, enjoining these actions, this is sort of going, it's, as you said, carte blanche.
Are there any Republican attorney generals, or I guess, is the proper term attorneys general with the plural?
It's attorneys general.
So are there any Republican attorneys general that are participating in this united front or is it all Democratic? Or
it's all Democratic for the most. I've sort of looked at it. It's almost all Democratic. And one of the issues that I think is important is I look at Pennsylvania, and I look at the new Attorney General of Pennsylvania, who, Dave Sunday, a Republican, who said he would be independent. But so far, again, Dave's only been Attorney General for, about a month. So far, he has not joined any of these actions. And interestingly enough, the one that I was referring to related to the NIH, the judge in that case ruled that there'd be an injunction and that funding would have to continue, but only in the states whose attorney generals were involved in the litigation. So that Pennsylvania and Alabama, which were the two examples that the article made, they don't have that protection. I'm attorney. I think it's fair to say that it's very hard to bring a case against your own party. But the fact of the matter is that if in fact Pennsylvania is going to lose $2.7 billion in funding because our attorney general wants to be loyal to his party instead of loyal to his commonwealth, the judge is kind of calling the question.
Yes, it's got to be really frustrating, and I don't even know how many Pennsylvanians or anyone on a local level is fully aware that, whether it's their attorney general, their senator, their congressperson, that should be thinking of their constituents and putting them ahead of party. But people are so terrified to go against party, and especially Trump, because, it's past behavior has shown if anybody goes against Trump and policy and steps outside the party, it's almost career suicide.
Well, that's exactly right. It's exactly right. I think most people, certainly most Republican politicians are afraid of retribution, and I would argue that most, you know, many people are afraid because he has shown a interest in retribution. You can't. I mean, it's interesting. So the other thing that happened this week is it happened just yesterday. The Justice Department told the Southern District of New York to dismiss the case against Mayor Adams in
I
New
heard
York.
guys. Yeah.
And the reason is because, and they said the mayor has been supportive of the president's immigration policies, and therefore it's in the best interest of the United States to keep him as mayor.
So there's a clear tone and message that's being sent, which is if you go against me, I will come after you. And if you're for me, I will protect you.
Yeah, it's stark.
And sadly, I don't think that is exclusive just to the Republican Party.
In what way?
If you look at some of the pardons that were sent down by the Biden administration before he left office, that message was certainly carried in the same manner as far as the protection part, and that there are one set of rules for one set of people and another set of rules for the others.
Well, look, I think, and we talked a little about pardons a few weeks ago. Look, there are clearly, I mean, the pardon power is often used, politically. But so if I were going to do this, if I were controlling the world, I would, is this just the Justice Department determined that Mayor Adams was subject to criminal prosecution, then he should have been prosecuted. And when after the prosecution, the President of the United States decided, I'm going to pardon Mayor Adams, then that would be a legitimate use of the pardon power. I mean, it's interesting. The other thing the president did last weekend was he pardoned Governor Blagojevich from Illinois. So for those of you who are really, deep in the weeds, Governor of Illinois was trying to sell Barack Obama's Senate seat to the highest bidder. Basically said, if you want to I get to appoint, when Barack Obama ran for president or became president, he had to step away from the United States Senate, and the governors of states appoint their replacement. So he actually solicited bids and took a bribe for the benefit of appointing someone as United States Senator from Illinois. And for that, he was convicted of public corruption and sent to jail for 14 years. In the first Trump administration, his sentence of 14 years was commuted. So now we know a lot more about this. Commuting a sentence says you're guilty, but you've done enough. That's what a lot of the January 6th defendants got.
You've suffered enough. You serve your time.
Right. You suffer enough. You serve your time. Pardon means you're off the hook, as though it never happened.
And it's interesting. Let's kind of examine where this is leading us and the rhetoric that's being used around it, right? Like JD Vance is talking about things like, oh, well, we don't need to be so harsh with people. We need to be forgiving. And, there's, and that was directly related to, it's like a member, and I don't know if I'm going to get this exactly right, but I believe there was a government employee who was, terminated or resigned because of some racist social media posts that they had. And
right.
It was like a phantom account. It wasn't even that person's account. It was like an anonymous account that they were using, but it was traced back to them. And on that account, they were making some blatantly racist statements, right? So obviously, this is a person that, maybe deserved to be let go or to leave their post. But now JD Vance and company are saying, well, we want this person to be reinstated because, we all make mistakes and we all deserve forgiveness. And JD Vance, if you've, read his book or seen his movie, it's, he certainly has that in his past. So you can tell that he's sort of, drawing on that, right? Hearkening on that and applying it to, oh, well, isn't it, and I think Elon said something like, anybody can condemn somebody, but to forgive is like holy or
Right. And to forgive is fun. No, and Rafe, in fact, it was one of Elon's brute squad. And
right.
actually what made it even more chilling is what the vice president said is no one should have their career ruined by a journalist who
Yes.
uncovered this really bad behavior
So
on the
isn't that
part of this
dangerous?
what?
I see that there's so I see two interesting layers of concern with all of that going down. One is, should we be demonizing a journalist for shedding light on the truth? Is that's not a journalist going on a witch hunt. And
No.
I understand how people get frustrated, concerned, and upset with cancel culture and the age of outrage that we're in. But we desperately need journalists, quality journalists more than ever. And we need truth tellers. We need people that are going out and shedding light on true stories. This was a true story.
Right.
So to demonize journalists is very concerning to me. And then at the same time, to put this under the banner of a, a righteous view of forgiveness, which can then be applied to many religions, and forgiveness being a tenet of many religions, so that it's almost framed as a dog whistle to evangelicals, which is a big part of the Republican base, to say, well, you know what? You can almost forgive somebody for anything because to forgive is Christian.
Right.
Now we're mixing our laws with religion, and
Right.
we're getting away from the division of church and state.
Well, we're also sort of saying there is no line anywhere that can't be crossed that matters. And that's very troubling. I mean, I we haven't even talked about the other thing that happened last week where the president announced that he would like to personally develop the Gaza Strip and eject 2 million Palestinians from a place that they call home. And when asked by Brett Baer whether they could come back, his answer was no. And again, this is having an impact, beyond our country. There was a fragile ceasefire that seems to be unraveling before our eyes. And, speech has consequence. And again, it goes back to what is he doing, not what he's saying. So yeah, this is really we're at sort of an interesting point, and we're only 3 weeks in, and it will make for an interesting episode 5 if we're still around.
So, yeah, hopefully we're still around. And distractions aside, Eagle football celebratory parades aside, it's easy to get caught up in those types of moments, and it's easy to get caught up in whatever else is going on with distractions. Let's just call, as much as I love football and sport in general, and I'm wearing my Eagles T-shirt because I'm happy that they won. This is a really critical time in our society and our country, and we need to be paying attention.
Right. I think that's exactly right. I think what people have to do is don't tune out. Don't say it's just politics as usual. Pay attention. Okay. And at some point, and that's why chilling the press, at some point people will see and they'll make their own decision as to whether or not some of the things that are happening is good or bad. And that's the whole part about democracy. And that, that's the issue here. So I think part of what we're trying to do, and we hope people are enjoying what we're talking about, is paying attention to what's going on, having open minds about decisions that are being made, some that you agree with, some you don't agree with, but that fundamentally, we built a country based on a set of rules, and that the rules do change, but they shouldn't be changing overnight. And the reason we talk about the rule of law is it what holds a democracy together, because without it, that's that's chaos, and that doesn't work for anybody.
No, it does not. So maybe on that sobering note, let's turn things a little less sober and talk about Burgundian wines.
Yeah. So
Wines of Burgundy.
well, that's so as you know, the name of this podcast is Pinot and Policy, and we've gotten some comments from listeners that we're not talking a lot about Pinot, and part of that is because last month was dry January, so we were being kind to my co-host here. But let's talk about Pinot for a second. So Burgundy wine, where is really one of the original wine zones where they started growing wines, 2,000 years ago. And actually, Burgundy red is Pinot Noir.
It is indeed. And Burgundy white, much to the surprise of a lot of people, is Chardonnay.
Right.
That's one of my favorite topics to discuss with people because, you know, drinking wine in America, if you consume a lot of American wines, right? And Napa Valley is kind of known as the best wine in the US and certainly has the most commercial appeal and success. And the Chardonnays in Napa Valley are very much known for their heaviness. I mean, that's the same reason why people love Napa Cabernet Sauvignons is because they're so big and strong and bold and flavors like nowhere else in the world. That sort of mentality is also put into the Chardonnays, and that means they're very heavily oaked. And what I mean by heavily oaked is they are actually aging and sitting in oak barrels that are smoked and toasted at a much higher level. You have degrees of toast that can go into the barrels, whether it's like no toast at all, lightly toasted, like a decent amount, or if it's the first use or the second use. If it's the first use, wood is porous, so the wine is interacting with and actually being absorbed and then released depending on the temperature and the humidity. So that flavor of the wood permeates the wine, and in U.S. Chardonnay, you get some really strong oak vanilla flavors, and it just kind of punches you in the mouth sometimes. Some people like that. A lot of people don't. A lot of people like a more balanced wine as far as the level of acidity and other qualities that go into the wine. And a Burgundian white, which is a Chardonnay, has a lot of that balance. They've got incredibly unique limestone soils, most of them. Some are clay, but the ones that I love are limestone. And you get, as far as the villages from Burgundy that stand out, the people that fit that characteristic, Chablis is one of them. And this is another area, I think, where people, sort of misdiagnose what wine is, because in Europe, you will say wine is characterized by the region or the village. So you'll say, I'll have a Chablis, and it might even be on a menu. And the Chablis is just a Chardonnay, where in the US, we say, I would like a Chardonnay. And that Chardonnay could come from a myriad of regions. Where, Burgundy is characterized by the villages, and a Chablis or a Montrachet or even a Batard Montrachet or a Meursault. These are your classic white Burgundy Chardonnay villages that I strongly encourage everyone listening. If you think you don't like white wine, or if you think you even like white wine but you don't like Chardonnay, maybe you've only enjoyed Sauvignon Blanc, maybe you've only enjoyed Pinot Grigio or Pinot Gris, do yourself a favor and try a white Burgundy, ideally from Chablis, Montrachet, Meursault. There are others. Try that with some seafood. Try that with some veggies. Let us know what you think. I think it's going to pleasantly surprise you. And since we mentioned Sauvignon Blanc, that's another one. Sauvignon Blanc, one of the best regions in France that people know, is Sancerre. And people will say, oh, I love Sancerre. And it's primarily producing Sauvignon Blanc. So that's a great little tidbit that we wanted to share about Burgundy. We could talk about the same thing maybe another time in the future about how Eric started the conversation off with Pinot Noirs. And there are some great Pinot Noir villages in Burgundy that I think can offer a very different type of Pinot Noir that we get, in the US, people love the Russian River Valley Pinots. which is just north of Napa Valley. And then really a nice newcomer onto the scene is Willamette Valley in Oregon. Willamette Valley is producing some excellent Pinot Noirs. So we'll talk about red wine in the future.
Sounds like good. So listen, I want to appreciate everybody for joining us for episode 4 of Pinot and Policy. We finally talked a little bit about wine along with the policy. We hope you'll comment when you have the opportunity. Let us know what you think. And we'll look forward to seeing you again next week.
Thanks Eric.
Ray.
See you next time, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.